people, understanding who we are, how we are, and where love is taking us. Last week we discussed worldviews, self-understanding, and kind of inner health, just some thoughts on that. We kind of introduced the idea of the Enneagram to you, which is what the model that we'll be working off of for the next 3 weeks. So I'm excited about that. But before we get into that, I want us to go ahead and do a little activity, just get you in the mood of self-examination and analysis, which is really healthy because we want to learn as a body to be more self-aware, and we'll talk more about that as we walk through the Enneagram. So here's what I want you to draw this morning, and you don't look over and draw what your neighbor draws. We want to know about your own psychological makeup. So you draw, and then I will analyze. I love this game. So I want you to draw a person in the rain. Okay? Just draw a person in the rain. And that's all I'm going to say. Draw a person in the rain. And this isn't going to be I'm not going to give you a lot of time, so begin your artistic rendering. I think these I want to collect. So I just am curious to see what you guys drew. All right, I'll give you about 30 more seconds, so finish your drawing. Person in the rain. I don't see it. All right, how many of you have finished your person in the rain? Okay. A couple more seconds for those of you who are still filling in your details. Now, if we had more time, we would come up with a little story about your person and what your intentions were, but we don't have time to do that, so I'm just going to give you some basic observations that will help you to understand yourself a little bit more based on this, what would appear to be a random drawing. Now these I'm giving you, obviously this isn't biblical, this is more just for fun, but this is just kind of how analysis can take place in these kind of drawings, which I just think is interesting, how the brain works and how our emotions work. So now you can stop your drawing now. I'm sure it's beautiful and perfect. Let's talk about your drawing for a second. Beautiful. Oh, I like that. Some of you did it on iPhones. Beautiful. That way you can keep this and assess it later. The orientation of the drawing actually matters. So if the person on the sheet of your paper is located on the right side, it indicates you desire to grow professionally and your confidence in what will happen in the future. So it has a sense of that's kind of where your mindset is. If it's on the left, if the person's located on the left side of the paper, it shows your pessimistic attitude and also that something from your past prevents you from being happy in the future. So I will be doing counseling after this if you want to talk about it. If you put it in the center, then your person occupies a central position. It means that you're quite competitive, all right? I have no idea why, but find that humorous. So all you left people, talk to me afterwards. The umbrella is interesting. If you didn't put an umbrella, how many of you didn't put no, don't tell me, I don't want to know. If you didn't put an umbrella, it indicates that you have no protective mechanism and resources to cope with difficult life situations. Some of this will really preach, you know what I'm saying? So we're like, I need Jesus. If you have a large umbrella that covers the person almost completely, it means that you're very defensive The type of person who needs protection and prefers isolation. So all you defensive large umbrella people, take note. The handle of the umbrella does matter. You always need support and some action plan prepared, even if you know you won't need it, depending on how. I think if it's a curved handle or something, I don't know. I didn't understand that one. Sorry, don't get that one. There's also indications that are about your inner makeup based on the human figure you drew. If you did a front view, how many of you did like a front view, the person's looking? Okay, I thought that would be the kind of the common one, but it means that you do have an ability to confront difficult situations. So that must be encouraging for some of you. If you have a profile view, it means that there's a desire to avoid ambiguous situations, which is interesting. If it's a back view, it means that you need to go unnoticed. So I just don't. Did anybody put a back view? I just thought that would be a what. I just in my mind, some of these I think would somebody actually do that? It'd be odd. Anyway. The size of the drawing matters as well. If it was a small drawing, it refers to kind of like a modesty and insecurity, feeling of inferiority, low self-esteem. If you drew your thing real little, if you drew a very large, big thing, it kind of filled the whole thing. Then there's a need to be recognized, and you're prone to vanity. So, I love these. Anyway, okay, there's also an indication based on how you drew the picture. Most people draw the picture starting with the head, okay, and then you finish with the raindrops. But if you started with the feet, it shows that you tend to choose the wrong way to solve problems. If you started with the umbrella, it can be a sign of excessive defensiveness. I have no idea why, but they've analyzed these things. Does the person move in your drawing? If the person is staying still, it's a still shot. It shows that you want to protect yourself from the surrounding world and that you have some problems with adaptation. If the person is walking, it means that you know where you're heading with your life. Now, that's their interpretation, these professionals. And the reason I do these is partly just so I can mock you in your paint. No, the reason I do these is because there is something like, if you drew one that's kind of a negative thing, you're a left side of the paper person, and there's something in you that just kind of goes, what? Or no. It's just interesting to gauge the reaction of your heart when you start to do some self-analysis. And when you start to say, there's some deficiencies, there's some problems in my heart, how you react to that is really critical and important. Because when we're walking through this model we're going to be walking through, you're going to notice some negative things about you and your personality, and you've got to be okay with assessing that and working for growth in that, and not rising up with defensiveness against it. And so these little tests, the pig test last week and the Man in the Rain test this week, helps you just kind of get used to, it's okay if I drew a really massive picture and I'm like, well, am I that way? And just to assess and ask the questions. Those little models may not be correct, but they may help us to assess our hearts. And that's what we're trying to do here. We are trying to move toward transformation. So I'm going to give you a handout that for the next 3 sessions we're working through, and it's called Enneagram Spiritual Formation Plan, okay? Now, don't give it up yet. Give me 1 second, because once I give it, they're going to be like, and then they won't listen to me. Anyway, because that's really cool, and it's really well done, and I was actually creating my own grid, and then Ben emailed me and said, somebody's already done it really well, and so then, he just, all my time, he just wasted. Anyway, and so I saw this great grid, Ben's spiritual gift is resourcing, so I used that, and so I went ahead and printed that out, and I said, we're just going to go through this because it's so well done. There's no need for me to try to reinvent the wheel.
His spiritual gift is resource?
That's just one of them.
Doesn't that mean he's good at getting other people to do things?
That might be correct. I'm not sure. But I want to give you, before I hand out this paper to you, and you get, immersed in it, I want you to approach it a certain way, okay? I tried to set you up for this last week, so just a couple more thoughts on how to approach this model. Last week we talked about the fact that it's not a perfect model. There's no perfect model, but it just helps us assess some things about our personality that I think is helpful, and especially helpful as we learn to love each other and as we progress in our sanctification. I've been reading a good bit on this particular model, and a lot of people say it's been one of the most helpful tools. It's a tool to help them progress in their sanctification. It doesn't take the place of the Holy Spirit and the Word of God. Obviously, that is our primary resource for our sanctification, but it helps us to just be a little bit more attuned to what's going on inside us and how we're wired and how we're bent towards sin and how God's even gifted us and uniquely crafted our personality. So that's what we want to be aware of. So here's a couple thoughts before we jump into this. One, I want to encourage you to learn all 9 of the principles, all 9 of these types, before you firmly assess your own personality. Okay, so take it slow, and just let's kind of like if you're the first one, we're going to talk about type number 1 today, and if that's you, then you're like, well, I'm done. I figured out what I am. No, because we're like actually trying to love each other better. So the likelihood is that just because you're number 1 doesn't mean your mate is number 1, doesn't mean your children, doesn't mean your best friend, doesn't mean that person that you might marry someday or whatever, your brother, your sister. So we need to learn all 9 of them so we can learn to interact well and encourage and help with the sanctification process of everybody, all these different types, okay? So learn all 9 before you make a firm assessment of your personality. So we're only going to go through 3 today, if we even get that far, and we're going to go through 3 the next week and 3 the next week, okay? The next thing is, as we're walking through these, you're trying to discern where you're at home in the descriptions. Because there's going to be a lot of descriptions, and so you'll kind of get this sense of, I'm at home there. Like, that just feels like my vibe, and that'll help you as you kind of try to self-evaluate. Again, there's no rush. That's why you're going to take this material home, and you can wrestle with it and think about it, and even talk to others about it who are going through it and saying, what do you think about this? How does this work in your life or my life? Another thing is, be aware of being uncomfortable with a particular personality. You might go through one and you're just kind of uncomfortable with it. That might be a clue that's yours. Depending on your personality, sometimes we have this like desire not to know who we really are. It's kind of this fear thing, like I don't really know if I really want to know myself that well. And so just be aware that sometimes being really uncomfortable with the descriptions, it's because that might be you. And so that's another clue that, hey, I need to kind of sit here and wrestle with this one. Let others in on the assessing process for you, even though this can be scary and it's kind of risky emotionally, but let others speak to, what they think you are, and when they're hearing these descriptions, is that how you see me? And that it helps to do this in community. I really believe that healthy self-awareness, understanding, is cultivated in good community. Because the reality is that most of us aren't really, fully aware of what we really act like and what we do. I see it. Thank you, Billy. There's no cockroach over there. Don't look that way. Okay. So I want a little quote by an author that wrote a book on this from a Christian perspective. Thank you. Did it really come over there? Wow. We're going to talk about Billy first today, and that's going to be fun. No. This is a quote that I think is helpful. Others generally recognize our sin much more readily than we ourselves. How many of you have found that to be true? Others tend to recognize our sin more quickly than we do. If you want to ask my wife, she knows what my sins are. They're very big to her. And I'm like, really? I don't think that's my problem. That's just because we tend to kind of back off on our sin. And this author says that this is the case. That's another reason, he says, why we need binding fellowship with other people. When we are alone, we can easily surrender to the illusion of being true saints. Isn't that so true? Like when we're alone, not interacting with people, we can kind of surrender to this idea of our spirituality being way farther and way more developed, more mature than it really is. Yes. The author I'm speaking of right now, and I'll quote from probably a good bit, is Richard Rohr. It's the Enneagram from a Christian perspective. It's a very good book. He says, God has given us other people so that they can keep bringing us back to the solid ground of reality. Oh, that's so good because it's so true. I tend to live in a non-real place a lot of times, and my family tends to draw me back to reality. And depending on what kind of personality type you are, you'd have more of a tendency to live in a non-real place. And you need some of these realist people to bring you back to reality.
which is helpful. This happened with my pastor and I in the first church I served in. I was the associate pastor. It was a small church. It was kind of a church plant deal. I was like the second staff member, and I just basically did everything he told me to do. But we just were kind of like a tag team, a dynamic tag team. We loved it, and so we would come up with these grand ideas. I mean, they were massive, and they would require all kinds. And neither of us were detail people, so just like vision, dreams. How can we change the community? And thankfully, his wife was the church secretary. It was kind of like his personal secretary, but she was always in the office. And so we'd bring her, we'd be all excited. We'd be like, we got this incredible idea. We'd have our charts, we'd put it on the board, and she would kind of look at it, and she'd like take it apart. Like, she would just, this won't work, this won't work, this won't work, this won't happen, this can't be possible. How are you going to get 600 people to do that? And she would just kind of walk through this thing, and then we'd kind of like, then we'd say, get out of here. Go back to visioning again. Because visioning is much more fun than, actually planning it out. And so what happens is it's so important, though. Like, she was a significant part because Steve and I, his name was Steve too, Steven, kind of like Daryl, but we would have had all these grand schemes that never would have been possible if it wasn't for just one realistic person walking into the room and saying, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard, and walking back out. And so I always give her a hard time. We both, he and I always give her a hard time about. She always bursts our bubbles. But we're very grateful for people like that. You need those kind of people to bring you back to reality. Another thing, just as you're walking through these, is remember that each personality type is a good thing. That's one of the reasons I like the way that this frames it, this paper I'm going to give you, because it frames it from a more positive perspective instead of a lot of the Enneagram designations frame it more from a negative perspective. And so I think the whole point of being a unique people is that God has made us different on purpose, and it's good. And so don't begin to understand your personality type and be like, stink, I wanted to be a number 4 or 3, and I'm stuck with a number 9 or whatever it is, because that kind of happened to me. Like, there was one I really wanted to be, and then I realized which one I was, and I was kind of bummed out a little bit, and so, but the point is, God has made you like you are for a reason, and you're needed, and it's a good thing. So don't be afraid to be honest with who you are. No type is better or worse than the rest of them. It's not like one type's the better type to be. One author said, the same author I just mentioned, said all 9 of these types we're going to walk through are in need of redemption, and all 9 have unique gifts that only they can bring into community. I think that's important to remember, that all these need redemption, all these have tendencies toward selfishness and insecurity, but all of them can be a significant part of the community and the body as God has designed us uniquely. Also, when we're walking through these, we're going to be aware that each of these personality types can be healthy or can kind of be kind of average, like kind of wrestling with these health and unhealth, and then some can be just very unhealthy. And so as you're walking through this, what we're wanting to do is not mask who we really are. We've got to take off, part of looking at your personality is kind of taking off your mask and trying to see who you really are and who people see you as you are. And like, do you play a game with people? This is who I really am, but when I'm with people, I kind of play this game. Certain personality types tend toward that more than others. So we want to take our masks off. And one of the authors from this one called The Road Back to You, which these are also followers of Christ. And this is I would actually recommend this one first because it's an easier read than this one. But The Road Back to You, the guy author talks about how the fact that he one time had this bright idea to go to this upper class kind of golf resort gathering, and he and his friends were 15 years old, and they were going to streak in the middle of it all. They thought this would be the greatest idea ever. So they were 15. And so they said, well, we're going to do this. Okay, right. So they all got, it was like 5 or 10 of them. And they're like, we're going to do this. It's going to be awesome, And I don't know why 15-year-olds think that's awesome. But we're going to do this. And they're like, but what happens if they recognize us? Because somebody might recognize us. So they said, well, let's wear masks. So they wore ski masks. And so in the middle of this high kind of fluting, 5-course thing, they just come streaking through, just with ski masks on. And later that day, they finished it. I thought it was great. And so later that day, the next morning, his mom was serving him breakfast, and she was like, we were out last night. He's like, oh, yeah, where were you? He's like, with this ski resort gathering thing. He's like, really? Interesting. He said, yeah. There was some, bunch of 15-year-old boys streaking through the thing in the middle of the dinner. He's like, really? That's crazy. She got into his face and said, son, I'd recognize your scrawny little butt anywhere. So he was busted big time. And this author uses that as an illustration to say, we think we're fooling everybody because we got our mask on, but the reality of who we are comes out. And the reality is, a lot of us think that we are playing some kind of, we are making the person, this kind of person that we think we are, we want to be, and we think that's how everybody perceives us, as this little person we've built up. And we're running through doing our thing, but people are seeing and sensing something totally different. And that's why it's so important in community to assess with humility who I really am, okay? And then to be willing to listen to others, husband, wife, kids, friends, other church family, as they help us assess how we're coming across to people, how we're hurting people, how we're not loving people well. Because isn't that the ultimate issue here? Are we loving well? That's what this is about. Okay? So that's just, as you go into this, that's kind of how I want you to kind of process this personality stuff that we're going to be wrestling with. Thomas Merton said, before we can become who we really are, we must become conscious of the fact that the person who we think we are here and now is at best an imposter and a stranger. And that's just because we have a tendency to put masks on and play games. It's just the reality. So what does this mean? This means that we're not yet the best version of ourselves because of sin, right? Everybody in this room is not the best version of themselves because of sin. It also means that we have to do some honest self-evaluation. We've got to humble ourselves before God and work for real maturity as we relate to others, to God, and to ourselves. So let's talk about the types. So Ben, or would you mind handing out one of these? We're going to go through the first three, so don't rush ahead and start to read all of them. Yeah, there should be one for everyone. Let's do one per couple, if you're a couple, and then if you're a youth or a single, or if you're single, you get to have your own, but if you're a couple, you can share yours. That'll make it easier for you to nudge each other and stuff, so that'll work out perfectly. Yeah, so this, you don't be overwhelmed, but the reason I gave you this big thing is because they put this all together, and it was so well done that I didn't really want to have to redo it and not be as good as they did it. So we're not going to use all this. I'll let you look at this later. Some of you will go back and read it all and try to figure it out. We've already talked a lot about what they talk about in the first 2 pages. They're just kind of setting you up like I did last session. So we're going to turn to the first type 1, and they have labeled this person the good person. Most grids, Enneagram grids, label this the perfectionist, okay? So the perfectionist comes across a little negative. They're trying to say that as created by God, this type of personality can flourish in this perfectionism that can be the tendency if there's insecurity. So they've labeled it the good person. I'm going to be referring to it as the perfectionist as well because it's the same designation. It's just the good side and the possibly negative side. So look at underneath type 1. It gives 4 words that describe this personality type: perfectionist, idealist, principled, critical. These aren't necessarily good or bad necessarily. They're just trying to give you some framework to how this personality works. When it talks about the survive, it's going to give you these little designations, like what does this person tend to, what's the thing that kind of breaks them down or that ultimately is the barrier to their flourishing in other relationships. So that besetting sin is going to be identified as anger. That doesn't mean that if you struggle with anger, then you're a type 1, or if you don't. We all struggle with anger, okay? We all have tendencies toward a lot of these things, but what they're trying to say is that certain personality types tend to react to protect themselves in this way. And so you just kind of want to start assessing your heart and saying, is this part of the way that I frame life and look at the world and relationships and react and respond? The survival strategy, I think, is really important. Certain personality types have survival strategies that help you understand what matters to them, what is important to them. And what matters to the good person is being good. Okay, it's that simple. This person, they must be perfect and good. They're idealists. They're motivated and driven on by a longing for a true, just, and moral world. Okay? So there's good things about this perfectionist or the good person. There's bad things. And there's kind of things that are kind of muddled in the middle because of our flesh and our sin nature and the personality God has made us. But these people tend to have a high expectation of others and themselves. They have very high expectations for people, but even higher for themselves. So they tend to get disappointed with a lack of perfection in things. So there tends to be, if they're not careful, a tendency toward judgmentalism and resentment, especially in themselves. They have a hard time accepting imperfections, especially their own imperfections. It's this wrestling in their mind, these voices in their mind that are constantly condemning them because they don't meet up to the standard they have set for themselves. It's a very tiring place to live as a one. Ones are very emotionally exhausted. A lot of people think that Martin Luther was a one. We'll mention different people who are these things, but the one that I think tends to best be like a kind of a prototype of the one is Lucy on the Peanuts. You remember Lucy? Okay, she has her little setup booth that she gives advice on how the world can be better and all this stuff. One time she said, "I can't help thinking that this would be a better world if everyone would listen to me." That's a one statement right there. I mean, they have got the plan. They have the high expectation. And in their minds, they're living it out too. You know. There was a German writer named Kastner, and he was raised by his mother. He was kind of a model boy, and I'm quoting that. He's a model boy. He was a moralist. That's how he described himself as a child. He never married and wrote at least one postcard to his mother every day. Youth, remember that? No. One postcard at least to his mother every day. He became famous worldwide. His children's books are famous. And he would constantly in his books, he would challenge young readers not to let people drive their childhood out of them. But ironically, all his characters tend to act more like little adults. And this is what you'll find with children who have one kind of personalities, this perfectionist personality. They're often too mature, morally lofty, and rational, even from a young age. So they attempt to be model children from a very early age, and that sometimes has to do with the fact that they either have a very moralistic or perfectionistic parent. So they get the signal from their parent that you're only good if you're perfect, and so they try to live up to that the rest of their life. They strive to earn love and acceptance from them by being perfect, and they tend to act like an adult too soon because they're trying to live up to these standards of perfection. It's very exhausting and tiring. They desire to be perfect for acceptance of those who are closest to them. They tend to have this kind of like grid, or they develop a grid, a criteria for judging what is right or wrong, good or bad, and their grid is the only grid, by the way, you know. They tend to want to be good so they won't be punished, that they, you know, these voices they hear in their head from a very early age are be good, try hard, do it better. It just kind of drives them. This is kind of the idea of one. So ones have high expectations for themselves and others. They're also terrified of making mistakes. This is a one. I am not a one. I am not terrified of making mistakes. I don't mind making mistakes. It happens a lot, you know, and I'm like, okay, you know, move on, you know. But ones, no, it's like, I can't fail, you know, because they've got to maintain this level of perfection. They have a difficult time making big decisions because they're afraid of making a mistake. Oftentimes, some of these little things start to jog somebody's that I live with somebody like that, They tend to feel the pressure of a condemning conscience more than others. They tend to get a guilty conscience immediately. They're very sensitive. There's this, in this book, Enneagram, the Christian Perspective, the author says, inside ones, we're just calling them ones, court is continually in session. They are their own prosecutor, defender, and judge. The conflicting voices keep nagging them. They bicker, interrupt, contradict, and correct each other. It's an endless inner trial. And I know ones, and I know that this is what takes place in their hearts and minds. And it always baffled me. And I would try to talk to them, and I'd say, just stop it. Why are you living in that inner court thing, always, not living up to these expectations? And it was because I wasn't that personality type. It wasn't my tendency to live like that. But for those who are ones, this is those voices in their head calling them to be perfect are very tiring and pressing. Ones, if you're a one and you grow up in a religious or legalistic or moralistic home, you eventually will bust or become an internal nightmare. Because you take a one and you put them in a moralistic kind of environment, and one of two things happen. You just become this inner nightmare of more moralism and this kind of legalistic kind of person, or you just burst. So you say, why do a lot of people from really legalistic homes end up rebelling? A lot of times it's because they can't take it anymore. They just burst. And I've actually seen people from this kind of background hit these points. And when they explode, it's not good. It's messy. The great thing about a one, though, is they get the job done. These are get things done kind of people. That's why we love ones. If you have a task that's really important, you don't give it to some of these numbers. You give it to a one. You know why? Because it'll get done. You turn it over to a one, it's going to happen. I trust ones more than I trust myself to get things done because I know, for the good or the bad, they're going to put the pressure on themselves to make it happen because that's how they operate. And so they're very good at getting things done, accomplishing things. They tend to be honest and fair. They tend to want to set a good example. They tend to be very passionate about order. They tend to feel good when everything is in its place. Just when everything's in its place, they're feeling good. Now, this is why cleanliness tends to be very important to ones. The guy who wrote this Enneagram from Christian Perspective, his mother was a one. She believed that cleanliness was next to godliness. We've all heard this little phrase, So this guy, Richard Rohr, it's funny because he said he lives in a house now that is clean in every nook and cranny. He said, "You can eat off my floor." So he said this, I'm quoting him now because I thought this was funny because this is not me. He said, "I straighten up every time before I leave the city in case I die on the way and someone enters my house, everybody should know that I was clean and orderly." I don't even know how to think like that. Before he leaves, in case he dies, if they come in his house, he wants them to know that he is orderly and clean. So he straightens up before he leaves. That's a one. They tend to be very punctual and feel pressured by time, tend to stick to a strict schedule and keep detailed notes. If you want to know what something goes on, you ask a one, they got the notes on it, okay? Ones tend to be very serious people. They don't tell a lot of jokes. Okay, Gabe is not a one, so you know. They only give themselves freedom to be relaxed when all their tasks are completed. If every task is completed, then they can relax. This is why they don't relax very much. Because as we know in this broken world, it's very rare that all tasks are completed, right? And everything's put in order. So they have a difficulty relaxing because there's always more to be improved, more tasks that are undone. So it's important for ones to be removed from their normal space so they can actually relax. Christy has some one tendencies, my wife, and she's very much like this. If we're going to watch a family movie, I'm just well, let's just watch it. What's the big deal? Let's just sit down and watch it. But she sees everything that is undone, and so before we can relax, we all have to be miserable for at least 30 minutes preparing for relaxation, right? So she starts calling the troops, and I'm one of them at this point. Like, okay, somebody's got to clean the kitchen, somebody got to do this, somebody got to do this. And if we just stop and say, why? She said, because we can't relax if the house is a mess. Well, I can. So I'm like, what's the big deal? So we're all running around cleaning, and by the time we get to relax, we're like, nobody's relaxing anymore. But that's how ones operate, because they have to have things in order, and they can't rest until what's undone has been done. Why? Because that's their personality. Another facet of Christy that's funny with this is that it's with her choice of movies. Ones tend to be more serious people, and so sometimes they don't appreciate overly over-the-top stupidity oftentimes. And I've tried, like, the movie Napoleon Dynamite. That one, to me, is just really funny. I know, some of you are just, but I think it's funny. When he throws the steak at the guy in the face, I mean, what's funnier than that? Riding the bike. But Christy, those kind of movies drive her insane. It's like scratching on a chalkboard. And we've had this conversation for 20 years of our marriage. I'm like, why does that bother you so much? It's so stupid. It's not realistic. She would rather watch a good war movie that was based on true events, World War II or something, because her grandpa served in there, She wants to see something real and solid, not guys throwing steaks at people's faces as they're riding their bike. That's the ones have that kind of tendency. But there also tends to be a tendency towards self-righteousness, in that they believe that their ideal is identical to who they are. They can be overly critical with others because they don't live up to their perfect standards. They can tend to be the moral police. They tend to forgive others when they admit their sins, but it's rarely unconditionally. Ones, they'll say they forgive you, but sometimes there's the back in their heart and minds, it's we'll see if you prove yourself. They don't forget wrongs very easily. They tend to be ledger people, kind of keep track. They keep track of everything, so they keep track of wrongs done as well. Interestingly enough, they tend to deny themselves and even punish themselves. They're inclined to even kill off their own needs and feelings to accomplish things, to get things done. And this is this kind of self-sacrificing thing that can be a problem if it's not for the right motivation. But they tend to react in anger toward imperfection. They tend to refuse to accept that they're angry, so they'll often control their action initially while boiling inside, because they have to maintain their level of perfection. So they're boiling inside, but they won't show it, because it creates this kind of explosive thing. They can tend toward being workaholics, just because they're things done kind of people. Without help, they tend to be obnoxious fault finders. They tend to have a loud critic in their head. So this is just unredeemed, like ones who aren't redeemed by the gospel, by Christ, and aren't being transformed by the work of the Spirit, are continually looking for suitable screens on which they can project their negative feelings and moods. And I'm quoting, as a rule, this is the first person who happens to be near them, So they have to project these negative feelings on somebody, and if there's not a maturity of God working in their life, then this can be a lot and all the time. So the people closest to them get pummeled a lot. There's some anti-gospel tendencies, and in your folder there, the thing I want you to lay on to, you can look at the downstream practices, upstream practices. These are all helpful things. Like if you're a one, there's some things, you need to know your weaknesses, you need to know your strengths, and it lists them here nicely. And then you need to say, well, how does God want to transform my weaknesses so that my strengths, so there's maturity here. And so this one is constantly thinking, I have to be perfect. And so how do I live in this kind of I have to be perfect kind of way of thinking? Because ones can tend to be very moralistic. They can try to reach their own ideal of righteousness, and it can become a vicious circle of them trying to redeem themselves by their own goodness. So it's cool to be the good person, but not if you think your goodness will get you what you need. Like, and you're going to work for your own spirituality, your own righteousness. The ones need to understand some things about the gospel. And turn to that last little box, the gospel ones need to believe. This may be the most important part of this book that I gave you. The verse they're recommending that ones wrestle with is God shows his love for us and that we were still sinners. Christ died for us. And these are the kind of things that ones need to reflect on deeply. God's love in our sinful state, God's unconditional love even when we were in rebellion against him, when we were not good, when we were at the worst point, when we were rebellious, when we were doing nothing right, living up to the wrong standard, God loves us through Christ. Christ dies for us. And for one, that's hard to totally embrace that because they're constantly still trying to prove themselves, prove their perfection. So the gospel ones need to believe, this verse tells me that God knows all my sin and imperfections and still loves me. Ones can hardly handle that. In Christ, I am truly known and fully loved. I am loved for who I am, not because of how good I am, but because of Jesus. Jesus was good in my place. All my imperfections were put on Jesus, the perfect one. That's good. That's what ones need to wrestle with. That's what they need to live in. And so on the next side of the page, it kind of tells some levels of development. You want to get to level 1, and a lot of us live in these lower levels, and we need the work of Christ, the work of the Spirit, to help us make progress in the broken parts of our personality, which stem obviously from sin and our insecurity. So that's, if you're a 1, I would recommend you to wrestle with that at the end of these 3 times together, to go back and to kind of wrestle with that a little bit and do some of the practices that they recommend. That ones need some serious theological reflection. They need to learn to do some meditation on God's word, some contemplative prayer. I really think ones would be helped if they did some broader Christian reading, because when you read people that you don't agree with, it kind of forces you to see that your standard of what is like the ideal isn't necessarily just objective, like it's not scripture just because you think it. And so it helps to read other people. So I'd highly encourage that. Ones love nature because it's a place they can actually like, there's something about nature that helps ones to take a chill pill, you know? So it would help them. That ones need to learn to ignore duty, order, and the improvement of the world for a little bit sometimes, to play and celebrate and pray and enjoy life and rest. Yeah, rest is a big one. Ones don't rest very well at all. So that's a 1, and we love ones, and we need ones. We would never get anything done if it wasn't for ones, because these are get-done kind of people, and they're so helpful to have in your life. So if you are one, then that's a huge blessing, and you're a unique one, probably in correspondence with a lot of these other ones as well. So we're going to look at number 2. Number 2 is the helper, or the loving person. Most designations designate as the helper. From a more gospel perspective, we're calling it the loving person, because this is what the helper does well. They love well. And so the helper, they're very relational. They tend to be very generous. They also tend to be very insecure, and oftentimes very self-unaware. We're all very self-unaware and insecure, but there's something going on with this loving person, this helper. And oddly enough, they don't necessarily always strike you as prideful people, but pride oftentimes is the sin that is, it is for many of us, but 2s need to wrestle with pride at a significant level. There's an underlying emotion, tends to be shame, and we'll talk about that. But the survival strategy, I think, is really important to note. I must be helping and caring. It's like this. They're not full people if they're not helping and caring for others. And that can be a good thing, or it can be a negative thing if it's taken to an extreme. I want just a couple of things about 2s. They tend to be very loving, caring, serving people who have many friends, and tend to be kind of a safe place for people who are struggling. They adapt well to changing circumstances, so that's good. On the bad side, they tend to be codependent. They desire to be loved and will often take any substitutes for love, even if it's just appreciation or just somebody needing them, neediness, companionship. But they'll see that as love because they're so desperate for it. So they also can tend to be manipulative, insecure, and play the role of the martyr. In the kind of the middle is they tend to be generous, but oftentimes want something in return, whether they realize it or not. So a 2, they're desperate to be liked, needed, and appreciated. There's just this desperate need. And it's like the 1, they're desperate to have order, get things made right, get things done. The 2 is desperate to be needed. I mean, their word is, if you say to them, I need you, that's like the best thing you could ever say to them. I need you. They will drop anything. They will do anything. They'll rearrange their life just to know that you need them. They desire to be indispensable. They love it when you're in a position where you can't do it without them. That's what they want to be. They tend to take care of people or situations to the utmost, but often use this as a way to control others or situations. 1s hide their anger, try to hide their anger. 2s try to hide their neediness. They oftentimes come across like they're not needy, but there's this like desperate neediness, like I need to be needed. I need to be needed. That's kind of how they operate. 2s also feel betrayed and exploited when their love and service is not appreciated. So because they desire so much to be needed and desired in this way, if it doesn't happen, then there's a sense of betrayal, or you've just used me. And so they tend to emotionally rise and fall based on how much sympathy or appreciation they're sensing from others. They tend to be continually active, but the primary goal of this secretly, they're always doing something, always running around helping, doing something, taking care of something, serving in some way. But behind it, oftentimes, if they're not careful, is this longing to be confirmed and affirmed by others. This kind of person that they don't delegate because they want to be the one who has to do everything, and they want you to have to rely on them to do everything. And it looks like, man, they're just such helpful, serving people, and to some degree they are, but if they're not mature in Christ, if they're not careful, the motivation behind it all is they want you to need them because that's how they get their identity. If I'm needed, I'm worth something. So they constantly, and this is the scary part, they constantly tend to help others and so evade themselves. So they would rather help others. They love helping people who are broken and messed up and who are needy, and it kind of keeps the distance from their own neediness and their own need for some serious, significant help because they can just focus on their neediness and the fact that they need me and that I'm helping them and I'm serving them and I'm loving them, and then it makes them feel less needy themselves. So look at the inside your booklet there. I think it's interesting the Bible verse they chose for the Bible memory verse they chose for the 2. That this group of believers says that the John 13:8 would be helpful for 2s to memorize. Unless I wash you, you shall have no part of me. I thought it's interesting what they say. 2s are more uncomfortable doing the washing. 2s are more comfortable doing the washing. Pride will cause them to want to resist being served by others. But Jesus solemnly warns Peter that if he doesn't humble himself and admit his weaknesses and neediness, then he cannot have a relationship with Jesus. For Jesus came to serve, not be served. 2s must allow themselves to be served by Jesus and others in order to experience the love they long for. That's a really, 2s need to wrestle with these gospel rhythms. The gospel 2s need to believe is that because Jesus' grace is sufficient, I am free to assume the posture of a child, admit my neediness, and walk in humility. His grace is sufficient for me, so I don't have to feel shame related to my needs and weaknesses. And in Christ, I have a high priest who is able to sympathize with me since Jesus became a man. In essence, Jesus became needy so that I can be needy with him without the feeling of shame. The incarnation and the cross tell me how much he wants me. So these are the gospel realities that 2s need to wrestle with and live in, and it will allow them to be a healthy loving person instead of a codependent, overly needy loving person who needs the approval of others in their service and in their caring for others. So there's different things. I think one of the key ones, go back a page, look at downstream practices. I just want to mention this one. For twos, legitimate spiritual friendships are really important. I've had a number of people that were twos that I was close to, and one of the key things for them, as I tried to just love them and encourage them, I had to learn how to relate to twos very carefully. Like, if you're a 1 and you want to change a 2 and you just come in there with your list of demands and just lay it down, that's not going to go over well. With twos, there has to be, because there's this little neediness, such this deep well of neediness inside of them that they don't recognize, they don't want to kind of let out. There has to be this patience with them and a genuine spiritual friendship that can help point out some of how these things play out. I think you're doing too much. And I don't think you're doing it for the right reason. I think you're doing it because you just need to be needed. But you need to let somebody else do something. You need to give up some of those things. But you have to be able to say that with grace and care and love. And so if you're a 2, you need to have people who love you enough to say some hard things to you, but say it in a way that you can understand it and know that you're still cared for and loved. So it gives some practices that are just helpful kind of practices. The centering prayer is interesting. Don't get caught up by the terms. I don't really use that term a lot, but what they mean by centering prayer is it's good for twos. It's basically you're kind of you're coming in the posture of Mary before Jesus, just wanting to hear. Martha is distracted with serving. Okay, so Martha is obviously would kind of be a typical kind of 2. She's doing all the things she's supposed to be doing. She's serving, she's caring, maybe she's a little bit of 1 and 2, but she's running around doing all this stuff, serving, caring. She's so needed, and she's looking kind of judgmentally on Mary, who is breaking with cultural norms and not helping and just taking in the presence of Jesus. And obviously Jesus says to her, Mary's chosen the better thing. She's got me. Serving's good, but it's me. And she's just at my feet. And that's what twos need to learn, how to just sit at the feet of Jesus. And that's a hard discipline, but there's a lot of reward there for twos. Well, we've run out of time, so we're going to stop right there. We'll do number 3 next week. We'll try to go a little quicker. Sorry I spent so much time on number 1. I got to pace myself a little bit, go through these a little quicker. But I want you to take this home and just kind of review over 1 and 2. And remember, what we're trying to do here is first of all, just assess who God's made us to be and the weaknesses in our life that tend to not allow us to love well. That's kind of what we're aiming at here. So we want to grow in maturity. And so one of the ways we grow in maturity is humbling ourselves and saying, Lord, this is some of the weaknesses of my life. And if you'll show those to me and confirm those, if you sense a weakness, say to somebody who knows you, do you sense this is a weakness in me? As we were walking through the number 1 or number 2, I sense that I'm a number 2 or I'm a number 1. And is this a weakness in me that you've sensed and noticed? And if they care about you, they'll be able to appropriately help you to wrestle through that. Man, you don't know how that's worth its weight in gold. I mean, if somebody is willing to work with you like that and be honest with you like that and loving as they communicate to you, that is amazing. And so that's a gift, and that God gives you that gift so that you can grow in your sanctification and become more like Jesus. And that's what we're all shooting for. So let's love each other well. Let's understand ourselves. Let's pray and ask God to help us in this process. Lord, I just thank you for all the unique people represented here in this room, and each one with a different personality, each one with a different past and history and different home life, different influences. And we all come together in this kind of conglomeration of uniqueness. And we just say, Lord, how do you want to use us to love each other well? And so I pray, God, that as we wrestled through some of these things, that we would come to understand ourselves a little better, and then understand how you've gifted us and how you've wired us so that we can help others better. And so just make us more loving people as we understand ourselves and understand each other better. We do all this for the glory of King Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen.